this video, I'll discuss targets for privilege escalation exploits. Let's start with some common privilege control mechanisms that control the elevation or temporary elevation of privileges. The first is set UID and set GID for set user ID and set group ID respectively. This allows for the temporary elevation of privilege. This is for running programs that require it so that the permissions or access control can be modified for a task when it requires the additional privilege. This is done in order to access a file or database or network utility that requires a higher privilege temporarily. Sudo and the sudoers file. Typically used for administrative tasks, it is usually configured for password authentication. However, it can allow for a grace period of 5 minutes or so where the user can execute commands with sudo without reauthorizing. Commands run as sudo and failures to authenticate are logged to the system log or some logging facility configured to do so. A compromise of an account can usually be traced this way. doas or opendoas is a replacement for sudo, which works like sudo but with fine-grained permissions rather than a blanket access based on password authentication. It limits the commands and options that can be run by a user with higher privileges. Remote access, where there's a transmission of controls requiring some mechanism of privilege, is susceptible to man-in-the-middle attacks, MITM. So this could give the impression that a process or system is communicating with a different source than it actually is. Access tokens and encryption can be spoofed if the controls are flawed and vulnerable. We also have bootloader vulnerabilities. This class of vulnerability affects subsystems that operate at higher levels of privilege, usually in ring 0, like Grub or Grub2, the Grand Unified Bootloader Utility, Secure Boot or UEFI, which are vulnerable to the boot hole attack. This is one that's recent in CVE 2020-10713. This is a recent attack that targets a vulnerability in Grub2 systems that run under Secure Boot. This allows the user to bypass Secure Boot and install a compromised bootloader. And this is a relatively recent exploit discovered in 2020. And kernel module loading. Vulnerabilities in the modules that are loaded when the system boots, controlling what devices get enabled by the kernel. This is managed through the mod commands. Running lsmod will show you the current modules that are loaded. Automatic login or features that control the login mechanisms, programs that are automatically executed